Harmony Creek, Dakota Territory, summer 1878. The heat inside the general store was a thick, stale blanket woven from the smells of dust, cured tobacco, and dried apples. Ann Lee stood before the counter, her small frame made even smaller by the towering shelves and the weight of the silence around her. She was 18, but hardship had carved away any softness, leaving a delicate but unbending resilience. Her brown prairie dress was worn thin at the elbows and hem, scrubbed clean but permanently faded by a sun that was not her own. On the worn planks of the counter she had laid out her offering, a small stack of neatly folded linen scraps, each one adorned with a small, perfect line of stitching. A blossoming vine here, a tiny, intricate sparrow there. It was all she had to trade for a scoop of flour. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, was peering at the work through his spectacles, his expression one of weary consideration, when a voice cut through the stillness. "What's that supposed to be worth? A thimble full of beans?" Jed Blevins leaned against a pickle barrel, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a smirk pulling at his lips. His two companions chuckled, a low, greasy sound that clung to the air. Ann Lee did not look at them. She kept her eyes on Mr. Henderson, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. Blevins took a step closer, his boots loud on the floorboards. "Too small to be of any use," he said, the words a casual dismissal of her entire being. He nudged the stack of linens with the toe of his boot, scattering them. "Can't haul water, can't plow a field. What good is a sparrow when you need an ox?" Mr. Henderson sighed but said nothing. The other customers in the store, a farmer's wife, a pair of prospectors, suddenly found the contents of the shelves deeply fascinating. Ann Lee knelt, her movements precise and contained, and began to gather the scattered pieces of her labor. Each stitch felt like a mockery now. The shame was a hot coal in her throat. Just as her fingers closed around the last scrap, the door creaked open. The rectangle of bright, dusty sunlight that fell across the floor was almost entirely blocked by the silhouette of a man. He was immense, a figure seemingly carved from the mountain itself, his shoulders filling the doorway. Long, dark hair and a thick beard obscured much of his face, but his presence alone was enough to suck the sound from the room. He stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was at odds with his size, his eyes sweeping over the scene, Blevins and his sneering friends, the averted gazes of the others, and the small woman kneeling on the floor. He did not speak. He did not have to. His silence was louder than Blevins's taunts. The smirk on Blevins's face faltered, replaced by a sullen resentment. The giant mountain man had shifted the very air in the room, turning their casual cruelty into a spectacle of cowardice. The mountain man, whose name was Rowan, paid Blevins and his cronies no mind. His gaze passed over them as if they were nothing more than cracks in the wall, and came to rest for a moment on the store owner. He moved toward the counter, his worn leather boots making soft, heavy sounds on the wood. The space seemed to shrink around him. He stood beside Ann Lee, who had just finished gathering her linens, and laid a few coins on the counter. A heavy canvas sack of flour onto the counter with a grunt, then wrapped a thick slab of bacon in brown paper. Rowan paid, his large hands, calloused and scarred, handling the small coins with surprising delicacy. Ann Lee stood, clutching her small bundle of embroidery to her chest, preparing to leave with the familiar ache of defeat. She expected him to go, to disappear back into the wilderness he so clearly belonged to. Instead, he picked up the heavy sack of flour as if it weighed nothing. He turned, and for a brief, startling moment, his eyes met hers. They were a deep, clear gray, like a mountain lake just after a storm. There was no pity in them, only a calm, steady observation. Then he looked away. He walked toward the door, but paused beside her. With a quiet, fluid motion, he set the sack of flour down on the floor, right next to her feet. He didn't say a word, He didn't offer a glance. He simply placed the provision there, a solid, undeniable fact on the dusty floorboards, and then he was gone, the sunlight flooding back into the room as the door swung shut behind him. The silence he left behind was different. It was thick with judgment. Blevins muttered something under his breath and shoved his way out of the store, his friends trailing behind him like dogs. The farmer's wife finally looked at An Lee, her expression a mixture of guilt and reluctant respect. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and pushed a small bag of cornmeal toward her. "For the stitching," he mumbled, not meeting her eye. An Lee looked down at the sack of flour. It was a lifeline. It was also a brand, a public declaration of her need. Her pride, the thin, sharp thing that had kept her upright for so long, screamed at her to leave it. But her stomach, hollow and aching, knew better. With a deep breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she slid her embroidered linens back onto the counter, accepted the cornmeal, and then bent to hoist the heavy sack of flour. It was nearly half her weight, but she managed to get it onto her shoulder, her body straining with the effort. She walked out of the store without looking back, her head held high, the weight on her shoulder a testament to both another's kindness and the world's contempt. The path to her shelter was a dusty track that wound away from the main street, past the last respectable house and into the scrubland that bordered the deep woods. Her home was a lean-to, a pathetic structure of scavenged planks, rusted tin, and a tattered piece of canvas that did little to keep out the wind and less to keep out the rain. She spent her days in a cycle of relentless effort, foraged for wild onions and berries. Her eyes scanning the undergrowth with the sharp focus of a predator, because hunger was a predator that was always stalking her. The flour from the mountain man was a temporary reprieve, a small wall against the encroaching desperation. She used it sparingly, making small, flat cakes that she cooked over a tiny fire, the smoke curling up into the vast, indifferent sky. A week later, a summer squall blew in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind tore at her canvas roof, and rain lashed down, turning the dirt floor of her shelter to mud. She huddled in the driest corner, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the storm rage. It felt personal, as if the world itself was trying to scrub her from the landscape. She shivered, not just from the cold, but from a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache in her bones. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a clean, washed world and a profound sense of exhaustion. As she stepped out into the damp, sunlit air, she saw it. Sitting on the flat rock she used as a doorstep was a basket. It was not a store-bought thing, but woven from willow branches, tight and sturdy, its handle smooth to the touch. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry moss, was a parcel of dried venison, a small cloth bag of cornmeal, and a clay jar filled with golden honey. Tucked securely into the woven handle was a single, perfect hawk feather, its edges sharp and brown, its center a slash of white. It was a message without words. Provision, strength, a silent watching. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, who had left it. She ran her fingers over the smooth texture of the feather, a wild and beautiful thing. She looked toward the mountains that rose up behind her small clearing, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. He was out there, a man who spoke in actions, whose kindness was as practical and unadorned as the wilderness he called home. For the first time in a very long time, An Lee felt something other than the grim determination to survive. It was a fragile, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her. It was hope. She saw him again 3 days later. She was down at the creek, scrubbing a canvas shirt against a smooth, flat rock, the cold water numbing her hands. She was so focused on her task, on the rhythm of scrape and rinse, that she didn't hear him approach. It was his shadow that alerted her, falling over her, a sudden eclipse of the morning sun. She looked up, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. Rowan stood on the bank, silent as a deer, his massive form seeming to blend with the tall pines behind him. Dully. He let the silence stretch. A dully. He let the silence stretch. A comfortable quiet that was his native language. An Lee rose slowly, wiping her wet hands on her dress, a flicker of apprehension mixing with the gratitude she still felt. "The roof will not hold against the autumn rains," he said finally. His voice was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact, as plain and solid as a stone. He gestured with his chin toward the mountains. "There is a stand of good pine on the ridge, strong wood." He looked at her then, his gray eyes direct and serious. He wasn't offering to do it for her. It wasn't charity. It was a proposal. "I can fell the trees," he said. "The logs will be too heavy for you to move alone, but you can strip the bark. It is a two-person job." He was offering her a stake in her own salvation. He was offering her dignity wrapped in the guise of hard labor. He saw her not as a frail sparrow to be pitied, but as a potential partner, someone capable of work. The phrase Blevins had used, "too small to be of any use," echoed in her mind, but this time it had no power. This man, this giant from the wilderness, was telling her she was of use, that her small hands could contribute to the building of her own home. A wave of emotion, fierce and unfamiliar, washed over her. It was the feeling of being truly seen. She gave a single, decisive nod. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will help." He nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "Tomorrow," he said, "at sunrise." And then he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing as silently as he had arrived, leaving An Lee by the creek with a wet shirt in her hands and the promise of a solid roof over her head. The work of her hands would no longer be for mere scraps. It would be for permanence. It would be for a home. The next morning the air was cool and sharp with the scent of pine. An Lee met Rowan at the edge of the woods as the first light spilled over the mountains. He handed her a tool she had never held before, a draw knife, its wooden handles worn smooth with use, its steel blade honed to a razor's edge. He showed her how to use it, his large hands guiding hers for a brief moment, his touch surprisingly gentle. Then the work began. The sound of Rowan's axe became the rhythm of their days, a series of powerful, resonant cracks that echoed through the valley, followed by the deep groan and thunderous crash of a falling pine. His strength was awesome, a force of nature in itself, yet it was controlled, precise. He was not just tearing the trees down, he was harvesting them, with a respect that seemed almost reverent. While he moved deeper into the stand, An Lee began her own work on the first felled log. She straddled the massive trunk, braced her feet, and pulled the draw knife toward her. The first strip of bark came away reluctantly, but then she found the grain, the rhythm. Long, fragrant ribbons of pine bark began to peel away, revealing the pale, clean wood beneath. The scent was intoxicating, a clean, wild perfume that filled her lungs. The labor was grueling. Her shoulders ached, her palms blistered, but there was a deep satisfaction in it. This was not the demeaning work of washing another's dirt away. This was creation. This was the building of her future. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a shared, comfortable silence, punctuated by the sounds of their labor. A language grew between them, made of small gestures. He would stop, wipe his brow, and offer her his canteen without a word. She would have a pile of bark neatly stacked for kindling when he returned from felling another tree. One afternoon, as she struggled to roll a smaller log into place, he came over. Instead of just doing it for her, he showed her how to use a rock as a fulcrum and a sturdy branch as a lever. "The mountain teaches you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Use its weight against itself." She succeeded, the log rolling into place with a satisfying thud. She looked up at him, a small, triumphant smile on her face. A corresponding warmth flickered in his gray eyes. "You move fast," he commented, watching her flit around the logs, like a little sparrow in the branches. The name, which had been an insult from Blevins, felt different from him. It was an observation, a gentle tease that held no malice. "A sparrow can build a nest," she replied, her voice soft but firm. He grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. In those long, sun-drenched days of sweat and sawdust, a bond was forged between them, stronger than any nail, more durable than any rope. It was a trust built of shared effort and mutual respect. The cabin began to take shape, rising from the earth log by slow log. The walls were halfway up, a skeleton of a home, a testament to their shared labor that was visible from the main track into town. It did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, the rhythmic sounds of their work were interrupted by the thud of horse hooves. Jed Blevins and his two friends sat on their horses at the edge of the clearing, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "Well, look at this," Blevins called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Building a little nest for the mountain beast, are we?" Rowan, who was notching a log, did not stop his work. He continued to swing his hammer, the blows precise and steady. An Lee froze, the draw knife in her hand suddenly feeling heavy and useless. The old shame, the feeling of being small and exposed, washed over her. "What's he promised you, girl?" Blevins went on, his eyes ugly. "A warm place to sleep through the winter?" His friend snickered. "Heard he lives like an animal up there. You'll fit right in." Rowan set down his hammer and turned slowly. He didn't say a word, just fixed Blevins with that flat, gray stare. It was enough to make Blevins' horse shift uneasily. Frustrated at being ignored, Blevins dismounted. With a deliberate, swaggering kick, he sent a stack of neatly peeled logs tumbling down the slight incline. They scattered like spilled matchsticks, undoing hours of An Lee's work. A sharp cry escaped her lips. That was when Rowan moved. He crossed the clearing in 3 long strides, his size seeming to double. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply stood in front of Blevins, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and quiet fury. "Pick them up," he said, his voice dangerously low. Blevins paled, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "Or what? You'll growl at me?" The sound of another horse arriving made them all turn. It was, Blevins saw his chance. "No trouble. 100 level. 100 million billion." Blevins saw his chance. "No trouble, Sheriff. Just wondering about the legality of this structure. Squatting on town-adjacent land, isn't she?" The sheriff turned his attention to An Lee, his eyes dismissive. He was a man who listened to the loudest, most familiar voices. "He has a point, miss," Sheriff Miller said, his tone one of performative fairness. "There are rules. You can't just build wherever you please. I'm afraid you'll have to stop construction until we can sort this out at the town hall." He was placing the entire burden of the conflict, the entire weight of the law, squarely on her small shoulders. Just as the sheriff's words hung in the air, a final, crushing blow, another sound joined the tense tableau. The steady, unhurried clip-clop of a buggy. It pulled up at the edge of the clearing, and from it descended Martha Henderson, the wife of the general store owner. She was a woman in her 50s, her hair pulled back in a neat gray bun, her dress plain but immaculate. She possessed an unshakable composure that commanded more respect in Harmony Creek than any lawman's badge. Trace of alarm. Is there a problem with trace of alarm? Is there a problem with Miss An Lee's new home? The sheriff, caught off guard, tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Martha. Just a matter of land claims. Blevins here raised a concern." Martha turned her cool, intelligent gaze on Jed Blevins, who shuffled his feet. "A concern for the law, Jedediah? That's a recent development for you." A faint flush crept up Blevins' neck. Martha then addressed the sheriff directly, her tone turning from wry to factual. "This plot of land, from the Crete to the Old Oak, was designated as charity land by the town council in the spring of '68. It is to be made available to any soul in need who possesses the will to work it and make it productive. I should know. My father, Councilman Albright, wrote the charter himself. It's filed in the town records, 3rd page of the June meeting minutes." The sheriff blinked, his blustering authority deflating like a pricked balloon. He had no answer to such precise, documented history. Martha wasn't finished. She turned her attention back to Blevins, her voice softening but losing none of its steel. "And I recall, Jedediah, your own father making use of that same charity after the fire that took his barn that very same year. The whole town came together to help him rebuild. Some people," she said, her eyes sweeping over the scattered logs, "have tragically short memories when it comes to the struggles of others." The public rebuke was devastating. Blevins's face was a mask of sullen fury. He stammered something about not knowing, then mounted his horse and rode away, his friends scrambling to follow. Martha watched them go, then turned to the sheriff. "I believe the matter is settled," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, and with a final, uncertain glance at An Lee and Rowan, he too departed. Martha walked over to An Lee, her expression softening into one of quiet kindness. "You keep building," she said. "A body has a right to a roof over their head." She had not only defended An Lee, she had validated her, affirmed her right to exist and to thrive, using the town's own history as her weapon and her shield. Martha's public stand was a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of the town's indifference. The ripples spread quickly. The next morning, as An Lee and Rowan resumed their work, a man named Peterson, a carpenter who had been in the store during that first humiliation, arrived at the clearing. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat and set down a sturdy, well-made window frame, complete with a pane of actual glass. "Figured you'd be needin' this," he muttered, before turning and leaving as quietly as he'd come. An Lee stared at the frame, at the way the morning light caught on the glass, a small rectangle of impossible luxury. Later that day, the farmer's wife who had so studiously ignored her plight now appeared, her 2 grown sons in tow. They carried a small pot-bellied stove between them, its cast-iron surface black and solid. "Gets cold here come October," she said, her gaze direct and apologetic. "This was just sitting in our barn." It wasn't a parade of grand gestures. It was a slow, quiet procession of practical offerings, each one a silent apology, a tangible piece of the community's reversal. A rancher dropped off a bundle of thick wool blankets. The blacksmith sent over a box of nails of varying sizes. Each gift was left with minimal fuss, a recognition that their earlier silence had been a form of harm, and that action was the only appropriate penance. Rowan watched it all with his usual quiet observation, nodding his thanks to those who met his eye. He understood this language of deeds. He saw the shift, the slow turning of the town's heart, prompted by one woman's courage. An Lee accepted each offering with a grace that was both profound and heartbreaking. She, who had been deemed worthless, was now the recipient of the town's collective conscience. She thanked each person with a quiet, dignified nod, her gratitude too deep for simple words. The cabin was no longer just her and Rowan's project. It had become a community endeavor, a structure being raised not just from logs and nails, but from remorse and a rediscovered sense of decency. The walls that were once a symbol of her isolation were now being built by the very people who had enforced it. She was no longer the outsider at the edge of town. She was a neighbor whose home was being woven into the fabric of Harmony Creek. The change was a balm on the raw wound of her exclusion. A hopeful light pushed back the long shadows of her past. The cabin was nearly finished. The last log was in place. The roof was sealed with pitch and sod, and the window frame Mr. Peterson had brought was set snugly in the western wall. The inside smelled of raw pine and clean earth, a scent of safety and permanence. Evening was falling, and a cool breeze whispered through the trees, but inside the small single room it was still and peaceful. An Li was sweeping the last of the wood shavings out the door while Rowan was fitting the heavy plank door to its leather hinges. They worked in the comfortable silence that had become their custom, their movements synchronized by weeks of shared labor. When the door was hung, Rowan closed it, shutting out the fading light and enveloping them in the cozy dimness of the interior. "It is done," he said, his low voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. He turned to face her. In his large hand he held something. He opened his palm, and resting there was a simple leather cord. Tied to it was a single river stone, worn smooth and gray, with dark lines running through it like veins. It was a perfect stone, one that fit comfortably in the palm, its surface polished to a soft sheen from what must have been weeks of handling. "I found it in the creek," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "A stone holds its place. The water rushes over it, the seasons change, but it remains. It does not wash away." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. Every word was a promise. It was a vow of constancy, of permanence, of a strength that endures. He was not just giving her a stone, he was telling her he would be her stone. He held it out to her. She reached out, her small fingers brushing against his calloused palm as she took the cord. The stone was still warm from his touch. She looked up at him, her heart a wild, fluttering thing in her chest. The space between them felt charged, filled with all the words they had never spoken, all the understanding that had passed between them in shared glances and silent acts of care. He was so large, a mountain of a man, but in his eyes she saw a gentleness that made her feel utterly safe. He lowered his head slowly, his movement deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. He was asking permission with his eyes, with the careful hesitation of his body. An Li did not turn away. She lifted her chin, a small, clear gesture of acceptance. His lips met hers. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was gentle, firm, and deeply reverent, a quiet confirmation of the home they had built and the bond they had forged. It tasted of pine smoke and wild honesty. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her skin. She closed her eyes, the smooth, solid weight of the stone in her hand a grounding presence. It was a commitment, sealed not with a ring, but with something far more elemental and true. The first autumn chill had settled over the valley, painting the aspen leaves in strokes of brilliant gold. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney of the small, solid cabin, a beacon of warmth against the crisp blue sky. Inside, the world was contained in a single, peaceful room. A fire crackled and hissed in the pot-bellied stove, casting a flickering golden light on the smooth pine walls. The hawk feather Rowan had left for her so long ago now stood in a small clay jar on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the first fragile seed of hope. An Li moved about the small space with an easy grace, the stone necklace a cool, constant weight against her collarbone. She was stirring a pot of venison stew, the savory aroma of onions and wild herbs filling the room. The worn brown dress was gone, replaced by a simple one of dark blue wool that Martha Henderson had given her, its color matching the twilight deepening outside the single glass window. Rowan sat at the small, sturdy table he had built, his large frame hunched in concentration. He was mending a tear in a leather strap, his scarred hands moving with a practiced, meticulous skill. The light from the fire caught in his dark hair and beard, tracing lines of silver and gold. Every so often he would pause in his work and simply watch her. A quiet, profound contentment settled deep in his features. He was a man who had spent his life in the solitary company of mountains, but here, in this small space they had built together, he had found a different kind of peace. An Li felt his gaze on her. She looked over her shoulder, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. It was a smile free of fear, free of the constant grinding weight of survival. It was the smile of a woman who was home. He returned the smile, a subtle lifting at the corners of his mouth that made his gray eyes soften and warm. There was no need for words. Everything they needed to say to one another was already there, in the solid walls around them, in the shared warmth of the fire, in the simple domestic rhythm of their evening. The cabin was more than a shelter from the coming winter. It was a sanctuary, a place born of public cruelty and private kindness, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest territory, a home could be built and a family could be chosen. One log, one stone, one quiet promise at a time. The world outside, with its judgment and its noise, faded away, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the steady beat of two hearts that had found their place.